Hi everyone, I'm Solomon, Content Manager at Growth Dynamics. I'm here with our founder and CEO, Charlie, for a two-part Q&A on marketing measurement. Charlie, how are you feeling today?
I think I'm feeling good. Feeling good.
Awesome, let's get right into it. How do we measure ROI of a new store?
So, what a lot of people would do is that they would just like look at the sales in that store. But the answer to the question is way more complex than that because there is a few things. First, the fact that your sales in your store is affected by other things. It can be your marketing, it can be your brand awareness, and then also your store is not only like capturing demand, it's also creating one. For example, what we've seen with one of our clients on the project is that we saw that the stores were actually increasing online sales in the surrounding areas. When you think, oh, but if I open a store, like it will capture the online sales, what we did see is actually the opposite. So there is the sales that is happening in the store, but there's also the sales that are happening outline because of the stores. And we can help people measuring this. The other thing is we have to be careful to make sure that we don't attribute all the sales in the store just to the store itself, because a lot of your marketing activity is going to drive people to the stores. For example, we have a client which is asking, how did you hear about us at every single booking appointment? And 30% of them said that it is because of Meta. And so this clearly shows that the reason why people get to your store is also because of the activity you do outside the store.
And what usually surprises the team?
Well, what usually surprises a team is the effect of stores on online sales and also the effect of marketing on online stores. I've seen very few companies which have done the required work to really understand the two. And this is where we're helping companies.
Every quarter, someone in marketing looks at the YouTube line and asks, why isn't it converting? What do you tell them?
I would say, why is that fish not climbing in that tree? And the reason is because it's not designed for that. So YouTube is great at creating demand, creating brand awareness. So it's really top of the funnel. When we work with companies, it's the reason why we implement self-attribution is because self-attribution is always much better than quantitative analysis to be able to understand what create that brand awareness. And so if you look at your non-brand search and you ask all of your clients from non-brand search, not brand search, how did you hear about us? What we usually see is that 50% of the people are not going to say Google, even if it's a non-brand search. And the reason is because channels like YouTube, for example, plays into the consideration set. So people are going to look for a specific product, like a car, for example, but they already have an idea of the brand they have pre-selected. And that's why YouTube is very strong. And so what's going to happen if you cut your YouTube and you increase your spend in your Google non-brand search, because if you look at last touch attribution, Google works better, what's going to happen in the end is that you're really at risk of having less Google conversions.
So the conversion sits with paid search, but the work happened earlier?
Yes, exactly. Like you have capture channels and you have demand generation channels. So paid search usually is when there's a high intent for the buyer to buy now. While a lot of other channels like Instagram, like YouTube, TV, all of these help to have like more people considering your product on the longer term.
Why doesn't the dashboard catch it?
Well, dashboard don't catch it because dashboard relies on attribution. And that is a bit of the issue is, well, first of all, you have the concept of last search attribution, which is extremely misleading. We talked about it with the Google versus paid search use case. And so, as I explained, you have to be in a consideration set and then you have to capture that demand. And the dashboard only find the capture, and multi-touch attribution is the same. In the end, the concept of the knowledge graph is completely overstated. And then we do see is that it doesn't capture like the buyer journey at all. For example, we had a client working with like one of the big MTA vendors in the US, and they were saying like 2.5% of their buyers were coming from Meta. And then when we start surveying, we found out that 30% of the buyers were mentioning Meta. And then when we run an incrementality test, it came up 25. So ballpark, more or less the same proportion, but very, very far away from 2.5. And so people who are using multi-touch attribution are actively losing money.
A few people in the industry say extending your incrementality test window doesn't magically make it fit for long term effects.
Yeah, but that's absolutely true. So because it's a signal to noise problem, it's a basic statistical concept. signal to noise. When you run statistics, you always have noise in the data, right? So the clearer is the signal, the clearer will be the impact you're trying to analyze. The more noise you have, the less clear it is. The strength of the signal, like everything, is losing strength over time, and the noise is still there. And so what happens is that at some point, your statistical model will not be able to evaluate the real effect because the effect is under the noise level. And so if you extend your window, it doesn't change anything because imagine you're already here under the nose and you extend your window, you're still under the nose. So just increasing the test doesn't make it fit for long term. And this is why you always have to be careful when, for example, you compare a Google channel with a Google shopping campaign with a YouTube campaign, because the Google shopping, very off bottom of the funnel, high signal on a very short time. That is a great candidate for incrementality. YouTube, it's working, but it's very likely going to really undermine the real impact on YouTube on the long term. So when you compare the two ROIs, for example, you have to know that the ROI that you had on YouTube is probably lower than in reality. So that's where there is a judgment call to make about how much you think. And how much you think that can be covered, for example, by traffic, self-attribution. That's usually how we try to evaluate the missing part.
Why do bidders fail at the upper funnel?
Yeah, so the problem is vendors are really focusing on short-term effect now. Like Meta, for example, the window 28 days window disappeared. We're on the 7 days window. So a lot of products have a much longer consideration journey than 7 windows. When you focus on very short term, what the model really try to optimize on is not revenue, it's optimizing on attributable revenue. So and that means is that the model is given the task to get as much revenue possible within that 7 days window. And so what the model is going to do is that it's going to target like the easiest win. So the people who are really looking for something most likely already has an affinity with your brand, etc., etc. So that really reduces the incremental effect of your marketing. That's the first thing. And the second thing, as I explained, is a problem of the window. Consideration are much longer than 7 days. And so people would say, that's okay, we have to target other metrics. Well, there's a real trap to that, is that if you, for example, ask a Meta campaign to focus on website visit, it will maximize the amount of website visits. So you'll have a lot of very cheap website visits of people who are never going to convert. And that's where you can't trust the algo anymore, because what you need to do is that you need to be able to target those more upper funnel metrics, but you need to make sure that it's still targeting people who are actually going to buy at some point. And so there's a lot more control to do on the upper funnel. It's way more complicated to do. It's not just like run item views add to cart on a campaign, because that's also a trap for a lot of bot traffic.
What do you think about geo-lift with synthetic control?
Well, there are a lot of problems with that. In theory, on paper, it looks great. You have a group that you're going to use for your treatment, you create a synthetic control, and then you run a test. Problem is, one, it's assuming that all your geos are similar. They're not. They differ in pricing, elasticity, competition, brand awareness. And so all of your geos are very different within the treatment group. And so if you look at the effect per geos, you'll see that the impact will be vastly different. So already just within the treatment group, the impact would be vastly different, and come up with like one ROI number is already like a big assumption. And then the other problem is that a lot of vendors are going to test 20% of the country, and they're going to say, hey, yeah, that is the estimated ROI for the entire country. Which, if you know that having like one number for the treatment group is already a big assumption, like you can guess that extrapolating that number to the rest of the country is a super big assumption. So it's just bad assumption and bad math at this point. And the other problem that I see is that when you decide to create multi-cell geo-split, like for example, you have a control, you reduce 50% of paid search in one group, increasing 50% on paid search in the other group, great idea. On paper again. And the reason is because your budget spend will be dictated by the algorithm. It is not going to be detected by your test. The algorithm, it doesn't care about your test. And so what you're going to see is that even in DMAs where you said to the group, I'm decreasing 50%, you can have some DMAs which have an increase in spend. Why? Because there's some underlying demand, competitive pressure, elasticity, etc. coming on in those groups. And so there's a lot of caveats that comes with those tests. And this is why you always have to do the test and you always have to validate it. And this is where I think there's a very big gap in the industry, is that we don't do the validation process. We just do the test and then declare that the ROI of that number is your US ROI, which, if you run a 7-number budget, okay, but if you run 8, 9 numbers marketing budget, that is definitely not the route I would suggest.
That's a hard sell to a CFO who wants the easy cut.
Yeah, that's because we're mixing confidence and precision. So when you look at a last touch attribution or multi-touch attribution platform, yes, you have like very precise numbers with 2 decimals, etc. Okay, but it's all thin air in the end, and you can't rely on those numbers. And so, yes, it is a more difficult sell when you have like CFO which are really like focused on the numbers. But the problem is that those numbers do not tell you the whole story. As I always explain, the sales is a two-stage. It's consideration set and then capturing. And so if you just focus on the capturing part, you're just going to kill your pipeline. I see it all the time. Normally, when you start to explain this part with a CFO and start to show other metrics that we can use to track the upper funnel, like share of search, what is the position against the competitors, that's usually when CFOs start to be a bit more open to the ideas of looking to something else than last touch and multi-touch attribution. Guys, if you like the video, just like and subscribe. You can go to my website where I cover my use case. And if you need a hand on anything, just reach out.